Superman so convincingly that millions of people believed he could do anything. He flew across movie screens. He stopped trains. He saved people from burning buildings. He stood tall in front of impossible danger, then walked away as if nothing in the world could hurt him. But on one afternoon in 1995, Christopher Reeve fell from a horse, and when he opened his eyes again, he could not move. Not his legs, not his arms, not even his body below his neck. The man who had spent years pretending to be the strongest person on earth was suddenly fighting to do something most of us never think about: breathe. He was 42 years old. He had a wife. He had children. He had a successful career. He had played one of the most famous characters in movie history, and now doctors were telling him that the life he knew was over. But there was one thing they did not know yet. Christopher Reeve was about to become something far more important than Superman. And before we get there, I want you to answer one question. If you woke up tomorrow and discovered that you could never walk again, what would give you a reason to keep fighting? Think about your answer, because Christopher Reeve had to find his, and what he eventually did with that answer changed far more lives than any Superman movie ever could. Christopher Reeve was not born into Hollywood. He was born in New York City in 1952, and long before anyone knew his face, he was simply a tall, ambitious young man trying to become an actor. He studied at Cornell University and later attended Juilliard, where he met another young performer who would become one of his closest friends, Robin Williams. The two were very different in personality, but they understood something about each other. They both wanted to act. They wanted to make people feel something. And they wanted to prove that they belonged. Reeve began working in theater and television, building his career one role at a time. He was not an overnight success. Then came the audition that changed everything. Hollywood was preparing a huge new Superman movie, and the director, Richard Donner, needed someone who could do something difficult. He needed an actor who could look completely ordinary as Clark Kent and completely believable as Superman. That sounds simple until you think about what was being asked. The actor had to be strong without looking like a bodybuilder. He had to be handsome without looking like a model. He had to seem intelligent, kind, innocent, and powerful at the same time. Christopher Reeve walked into that audition looking almost too thin for the part. But when he put on the Superman costume, something clicked. There was a calmness about him. He did not have to force the character. He simply looked like Superman. In 1978, Superman arrived in theaters, and Christopher Reeve became a star. Not just a star, Superman. For millions of people, the two became almost impossible to separate. He played the character again in Superman 2. Children looked at him and saw a hero. Adults looked at him and saw one of the most convincing comic book performances ever put on film. But Reeve wanted something else too. He did not want to spend the rest of his life being remembered only as the man who could fly. He wanted serious acting roles. He wanted to direct. He wanted to work in theater. He wanted to prove that there was more to Christopher Reeve than the blue suit and red cape. So he kept working. He appeared in films that showed a different side of him, including Somewhere in Time, Death Trap, Street Smart, and later, The Remains of the Day. He became an accomplished pilot. He sailed. He skied. He rode horses. He enjoyed the outdoors. He was not living like a man who believed his life had to be protected from every risk. If anything, he liked pushing himself. And that brings us to May 27, 1995. Reeve was competing in an equestrian event in Culpeper, Virginia. He was riding his horse, Buck. Ahead was a difficult jump. Reeve approached it. Then something went wrong. The horse suddenly stopped. Reeve did not. He was thrown forward and landed head first. The impact shattered the upper part of his spine and caused a devastating spinal cord injury. In a few seconds, the man who had spent years playing the world's most powerful superhero became paralyzed from the neck down. Everything changed. His career, his body, his independence, his family life, his future. But the hardest part was still waiting for him. Then it became, how am I going to live? That is a very different question, and it was one Christopher Reeve began answering with everything he had. Rehabilitation became part of his daily life. The work was exhausting. There were exercises, machines, doctors, therapists, and long hours spent trying to regain even tiny amounts of control. The progress was painfully slow. Sometimes it was almost impossible to see, but Reeve kept working, and he began to understand something that most people never have to think about. The world is designed for people who can walk. Buildings, sidewalks, bathrooms, transportation, public spaces, even simple things that most people do without thinking can become major obstacles after paralysis. Reeve had enough fame to get attention. He decided to use it. He could have disappeared from public life. He could have stayed home. He could have spent the rest of his years quietly dealing with his own condition. Instead, he started talking. He went on television. He spoke to politicians. He visited scientists. He talked about spinal cord research. And he began asking a question that sounded almost impossible at the time. What if paralysis did not have to be permanent? That question became his mission. And this is where the story takes another turn. Christopher Reeve was no longer simply trying to get his own body back. He was trying to change the future for millions of people he would never meet. In 1996, just months after his accident, Reeve appeared at the Academy Awards. People knew he would be there, but they did not know what to expect. When he came onto the stage in his wheelchair, the room stood and applauded. It was a remarkable moment. The man who had once appeared on movie screens as Superman was standing before Hollywood in a completely different role. Not as a superhero, not as an action star, as himself, and he did something important. He did not ask the audience to feel sorry for him. He talked about the power of movies and the ability of stories to bring attention to issues that people might otherwise ignore. That became a pattern in the years ahead. Reeve refused to let paralysis become his entire identity. He was still an actor, still a father, still a husband, still a director, still a person who loved music, travel, humor, and life. The wheelchair had changed what he could do. It had not erased who he was. And that distinction became central to his message. He eventually wrote a memoir called Still Me. The title said almost everything. Still me. Not the old me. Not the Superman character. Not the man before the accident. But still me. There is something powerful about those two words, because a serious injury can change almost everything about a person's daily life, while leaving the person themselves intact. Christopher Reeve understood that, and he wanted other people to understand it too. In 1999, he and Dana established the Christopher Reeve Foundation, building on earlier paralysis organizations and turning their enormous public platform toward research, support, and advocacy. But Reeve was not content to simply raise money. He wanted scientists to move faster. He wanted government funding. He wanted people to stop treating paralysis as a problem that should simply be accepted. He became a public face for spinal cord research, and sometimes that meant walking into rooms where he was not expected to belong. Congressional offices, research laboratories, scientific meetings. But there was another part of his life that the public rarely saw. Home, Dana, their children, the practical reality of living with a severe spinal cord injury, the endless care, the equipment, the uncertainty, the emotional weight. Christopher was the famous one, but Dana was living the same new reality. She was not simply the wife of Superman. She had become his caregiver, partner, advocate, and the person standing beside him through the hardest years of his life. Their relationship became one of the quietest and strongest parts of the story, and yet Reeve's goal was never to become a symbol of perfect courage. He admitted fear. He admitted frustration. He admitted that some days were harder than others, that honesty made him more powerful, not less. Because pretending that hope means feeling positive every day is not hope. Real hope is being frightened and continuing anyway. Real hope is having a terrible morning and still getting through the afternoon. Real hope is being told that something may never happen and deciding that never is not a reason to stop trying. Christopher Reeve became increasingly involved in experimental approaches to recovery. He worked with researchers. He participated in rehabilitation programs. He looked for signs that the nervous system might be capable of more recovery than people once believed. At one point, he regained a small amount of movement and sensation. It was not the miracle people sometimes imagined. He did not suddenly stand up and walk. There was no Hollywood ending. But even a small change mattered to him, because science does not always move in giant leaps. Sometimes it moves one tiny discovery at a time, one patient, one experiment, one question, one possibility. And Reeve wanted to push that possibility as far as it could go. He became increasingly vocal about embryonic stem cell research and other areas of medical research, arguing that scientists needed the freedom and funding to explore potential treatments. Not everyone agreed with him. Some criticized his political positions. Some believed his expectations were too hopeful. Others saw him as a powerful advocate who was helping bring an issue into the public eye. But Reeve kept speaking. And then, something unexpected happened. The actor who had once been defined by Superman was becoming known for something else: hope. Not the kind of hope where everything magically works out. The harder kind. The kind that says, "I don't know what will happen, but I am not done yet." By the early 2000s, Reeve continued working. He directed films. He acted. He appeared on television. He wrote. He advocated. He spent time with his family. And he kept pushing his body through rehabilitation. He even received a Golden Globe nomination for his performance in the television film The Brooke Ellison Story, which he directed. He was still creating, still speaking, still looking toward the future. But his health remained fragile. He depended on assisted breathing. His body required constant care. The injury had never disappeared. And then, in October 2004, Christopher Reeve died at the age of 52. The man who had spent years telling the world to keep fighting was gone. He had not walked again. He had not received the miracle ending that audiences might have expected from Superman. But something important had happened anyway. His story had become larger than the accident, larger than the wheelchair, larger than the movie character. Christopher Reeve had changed the conversation around paralysis. Before his injury, many people rarely thought about spinal cord injuries at all. Afterward, millions knew his face. They heard him talk. They watched him work. They saw him argue for research. They saw him return to the public stage. They watched him continue being a father and husband. And they saw something that Hollywood rarely shows: what happens after the hero loses his powers. That may be the real reason his story still matters. Because Superman was never really the lesson. The lesson was Christopher Reeve. A fictional superhero could fly because the script said he could. Christopher Reeve had no script. When his life changed, there was no special effect that could fix it. No cape, no hidden power, no final scene where everything suddenly returned to normal. There was only a man, a family, a difficult new reality, and a choice: keep living, keep working, keep loving, keep hoping, keep fighting for people he might never meet. And that choice matters, because most of us will never face exactly what Christopher Reeve faced. But almost everyone eventually meets some version of the same question. What do you do when life becomes something you never planned for? A job disappears. Someone you love dies. Your body changes. A dream fails. A door closes that you were certain would remain open. You can spend the rest of your life asking why it happened. Or, eventually, you can ask a different question. What can I do now? Christopher Reeve could not change the day he fell from that horse. He could not return to the life he had before. But he could decide what the next chapter meant. And he did. He turned his fame into a platform. He turned his pain into advocacy. He turned his wheelchair into a place from which he could speak to the world. And he turned hope into work. That last part is important. Hope was not enough for Christopher Reeve. He wanted research. He wanted funding. He wanted better care. He wanted independence for people living with paralysis. He wanted science to keep moving. He wanted the future to look different from the past. That is why his legacy cannot be measured only by the Superman films. Those movies made him famous. His life afterward made him matter. And perhaps the most beautiful part of the story is that the people who loved him did not remember him simply as a man who became disabled. They remembered a man who continued to live. A father, a husband, an actor, a director, a friend, an advocate, a man who still laughed, a man who still worked, a man who still had bad days, a man who still had reasons to get up in the morning, even when getting up was no longer something his body could do. And maybe that brings us back to the question I asked you at the beginning. If you woke up tomorrow and discovered that you could never walk again, what would give you a reason to keep fighting? Christopher Reeve found his answer in the people he loved, in the work he could still do, and in the belief that his life could still be useful. He did not need to become Superman again. He had already done something harder. He became Christopher Reeve again, the man underneath the costume, the man who had been there before the fame, the man who remained after the accident. And perhaps that is why his story feels different from most celebrity biographies. Most stars spend their lives trying to become larger than life. Christopher Reeve became famous by playing a man who was larger than life. Then life took almost everything away. And somehow, in the years that followed, he showed the world that a person does not become smaller just because their circumstances become harder. His body changed. His career changed. His future changed. But his value did not. That is the part of Christopher Reeve's story worth remembering. Not that Superman became disabled. Not that a famous actor suffered a terrible accident. But that when the life he expected disappeared, he refused to believe that his life itself was over. He kept looking forward, even when forward was frightening, even when forward was painful, even when the answer was not guaranteed. And maybe that is what courage really looks like. Not flying, not being fearless, not winning every battle. Sometimes courage is simply waking up, looking at the life you have been given, and saying, "All right, this is my life now. What can I do with it?" Christopher Reeve died in 2004, but the work he began did not die with him. The Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation continued his mission, supporting research, quality of life programs, and people living with paralysis. His name became connected not only with a fictional superhero, but with a real-world fight to give people with spinal cord injuries more choices and more hope. And there is something almost fitting about that. The man who spent his youth pretending to fly eventually spent his final years trying to help other people move forward. He could not change what happened to him, but he could change what happened next. That was his real superpower. If this story moved you, I want to know something very simple. When life takes away the future you thought you were going to have, what do you think gives a person the strength to build a new one? Write your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read it. And if you enjoy stories about the real people behind the names we think we already know, subscribe to Life Graphy, because sometimes the most powerful part of a person's life begins after the world thinks their story is over. And Christopher Reeve's story is one of those stories.